why would there be so many officers responding and helicopters and FBI and SWAT teams and all of this stuff if it wasn't true? If there wasn't actually an active shooter? Memory is a weird thing, especially under stress. So it's not abnormal for people to have conflicting reports. Purely my opinion, I don't personally worry about concealed weapons holders. They are, statistically speaking, some of the least likely people to commit violent crimes with their firearms. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Cheer Biz Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Cotton, and today we are going to be doing part one of my reaction to the incident at NCA Nationals of 2025. Now, I'm going to be talking a lot in this episode. I imagine it will be a longer one, and it's going to be a very heavy episode. So if you are not in an emotional place where you feel like you can listen to this, then I would encourage you to skip to one of my other episodes. If you're wanting just business-oriented content, please skip to another episode. I'm going to be giving you a lot of opinions on this episode, and I'm going to be giving you a lot of my past experiences. On the next episode, breaking down NCA and what occurred at NCA Nationals of 2025, I'm going to be giving you what I believe are the lessons learned and the things that we need to do better. But this episode is going to be much more about the event itself and some of the things that I'm seeing online and just my perspective. I'm just giving my voice at this point in time. So this is going to be a lot of opinion, and it's going to be a lot of opinion based on my background and my history. So just know that going into the episode that this will be my dialogue with you about NCA Nationals. So first off, I have almost no voice. I did have an event this weekend, but I was not at NCA Nationals. There was a local event in Portland that we chose to attend because it was right down the road and it had Worlds and Summit bids. And so I was yelling a lot and cheering for my teams, and my voice is a little bit thrashed from it. Plus, I think I'm coming down with something. So I apologize for that. My backstory, or the reason that I'm talking to you and the perspective that I'm talking to you from. Most of you who've listened to the podcast before know this, but we may have some new listeners if this gets shared to a wider audience. So number one is I have been in the profession of arms since I was 20 years old. I've always been very into firearms and that lifestyle of martial arts and firearms and those kind of things. And then I chose to join the ROTC program in college, was a commissioned officer in the infantry for the United States Army National Guard. I deployed to Iraq in 2009, 2010 as an executive officer in support Operation Iraqi Freedom, and served as an executive officer for an infantry company from Oregon. So I served overseas in Iraq for a year. I also was a sworn law enforcement officer from 2007. I graduated college in 2006. 2007 until 2022 was my last time where I was serving as a full-time sworn law enforcement officer. And now I am currently a sworn reserve law enforcement officer. In that time, I worked patrol. I worked as a school resource officer, where one of my points of emphasis was in active threat training and active threat mitigation. I spent a lot of years training students, staff, and faculty how to respond in these circumstances, as well as I got a lot of additional training for myself. And I've also served as a senior training officer for the department that I worked for. I was the lead firearms instructor, so I was our range master, and I instructed all firearms related combatives, to include training officers in both pistol and rifle certifications, as well as a combat gunfighting course that I developed based off of my experiences. I'm going to come to you from the perspective of someone who has been in critical incidents. In my career, I was involved in 2 different officer-involved shootings where I was faced with deadly force where firearms were used against others, and I was forced to use a firearm as well. And so I have a lot of experience with being in critical incidents. I have experience with the trauma of being in a critical incident. I have experience helping other officers through those things. I have experience in being shot at, in hearing gunfire when you're not expecting it. I have those experiences, and I'm going to speak to you from the perspective of my experiences and my experiences only. It is important to know that I was not at NCA Nationals. So everything that I know third and fourth hand. So I've seen the reporting on social media. I've talked to friends who were there. I've gotten numerous friends and athletes and staff members who work for me in the summers and things like that, who were all at NCA Nationals and experienced this in real time. So although I wasn't there, I've received a lot of accounts about the event, and that's everything I'm going to speak to is knowing just the accounts that I've seen online. I also think it's really important for me to reference before I go too deep into this is that your lived experience is absolutely yours. And nothing I'm saying here is meant to take away from any of your experiences. I'm not saying anyone is making anything up or being dishonest or anything of that nature. So even if I say something that is contradictory based off of my reasoning to the current narrative or to what you may have heard or believed was occurring, I'm not saying any of that to take away from that, because I am choosing to believe that no one is coming from the position of trying to blow things out of proportion and exaggerate things. Everyone's speaking their lived experience. And I talked about this with Jeff Benson with, their perception in that moment is their reality. It doesn't really matter if, in terms of like what your feelings and emotions are, it doesn't necessarily matter that there wasn't, to what we can see, a true active shooter, someone who is actively out there, shooting athletes and families. There was definitely some chaos and some incident that led to a wider incident, but that doesn't take away from the fact that it felt like that, and that may be what you were told. And so that what is in your mind, what was happening, that doesn't take away from your experiences. And those are your experiences and they feel real. And I want to validate that. So nothing I'm saying is trying to take away from that, although there may be things that contradict what your recollection is of the events. I say that because I mentioned I've been in critical incidents. I've been in an incident where there were multiple people involved, multiple professional police officers with similar or more training and experience than I have had, who all were in the same place. And like when I say the same place, I'm talking less than a block, basically in a very, very small area, probably 100 meters, not even 100 meters, 50 meters box that we were all within. And every single person has a different recollection, different understanding of what occurred because of, one, their perspective, and two, their response under stress. And we all have different memory abilities, and there's a bunch of studies into it. But it was very interesting the first time I went through something like that to hear how my perspective could be so different than other people's perspectives, and have officers who were like, I can vividly remember you standing over there, and me being like, I wasn't there. I was over here. And all of the evidence shows that I was right here. And they're like, but I just remember you being right next to me, because the last time their brain kind of took that image of where I was in that point, but then I moved. And so memory is a weird thing, especially under stress. So it's not abnormal for people to have conflicting reports. So that brings me to the first thing. So one of the things I hear people asking about is, well, why are there so many different reports? Why are there so many different stories? And that's because of a variety of circumstances, but not the least of which being everyone's memory and perspective is different. So people see things differently from the angle that they're standing at, from their own lived experiences, their own life experiences, their own past traumas. Like, it all imprints on us a little bit differently. And it is actually very, very common in these kind of incidents to have reports of multiple shooters and bombs and certain things happening that end up being found to not be true. And it's just because of the chaos of the event makes it very, very difficult. So for instance, in the shooting in Parkland High School, which was a horrendous event, there was numerous reports of multiple active shooters. And almost all of these events, from the law enforcement perspective, we tend to see there be reports of multiple shooters. And then once everything is figured out, it ends up that there was only one. And that's simply because of the timeline and the way things come in and the telephone game of calling dispatch and then them notifying officers and then officers responding in the moment, that creates a fog of war, a cloudy confusion that can oftentimes make it so there's a wide variety of reports. And so we experienced this in real time. Like I said, I wasn't there. The very first notification I had was I was at our competition, and actually my team had just performed. I was waiting at scores, and I got a message from another gym owner in a group message with a couple other gym owners. And that message was active shooter at NCA. And my heart dropped. I was like, because in my head, I'm thinking that there is literally someone in one of the arenas targeting families and athletes. And then I go through my immediate analytics of like, okay, well, how would they get in there with like any sort of a long gun? Because that's immediately what was in my head, was like a rifle. And I'm like, that would be pretty hard to get into NCA with that. So maybe it's a handgun, or maybe it's outside, or like I'm going through all of the like what ifs. And then within about, I would say 8 minutes, the story had transitioned to two dads got into a fight. One of them pulled a gun, and then the police shot and killed the person who pulled the gun. And that was the going story for about an hour and a half. And that they were evacuating athletes, was we had heard at that point in time that they were evacuating everyone. To which I heard, okay, they're evacuating everyone. That means that there's no longer a threat, because typically speaking, at least law enforcement is not going to evacuate people until they're sure that the threat is no longer a threat. That's like one of our kind of standard operating procedures. So I'm like, okay, that means that the danger is now passed. Now, I now know that that's not exactly what occurred, that it wasn't a controlled evacuation, that it was more just of a mass evacuation. And I'm going to talk about that more later. But I got that information. And then the story changed again to now there was no shooting. And I mean, I was talking to people from varsity who were like, I've heard from people who are there that said that there was an officer involved shooting, and like they're positive. And then it turned into there wasn't a shooting, there was a fight, and then there were some poles that fell that sounded like gunshots and caused this kind of mass hysteria. And then there was a fight that got posted online, and it was not where the fight originally was in like this, it looked like the sky bridge between the arena and the Omni. And it wasn't even really much of a fight. It was kind of a scuffle, tug of war thing. And then you hear, well, actually there was a fight over by the restaurants, over by the Omni, and it was a different fight, and there was more people. Then you hear a number of people saying, well, I 100% heard gunshots, and I could smell the gun smoke, and all of these different, we just kind of saw the story expand of, different people who are 100% sure they saw and heard and smelled these things. And so it created a lot of confusion. The reality is that that's very common in these circumstances, to see there be a variety of reports, different people who saw and heard different things. Now, I will just speak to some of the information. So I am always hesitant whenever anyone says, I heard gunshots. Gunshots are definitely discernible, but I've been around guns a lot. I know there's people that have been around guns more than me, but I spent 6 years training officers relatively regularly to fire guns. So I've been around gunfire for lots and lots and lots and lots of hours. I mean, we're talking 8 hours a day for multiple weeks in a row, repeated month over month over month. So I've been around gunfire a lot. And even then, I have a hard time discerning unless I'm right next to it. If I'm very close, I can generally tell the difference between the sonic crack of a bullet and the gunshot. So there's the gunpowder going boom, and that can actually sound it can vary based off of the gun. And the barrel length and all sorts of things can make it vary in terms of what it sounds like. And even just the end of the muzzle, what's on the end of the muzzle can make a different sound and a different note almost, in terms of the boom. And then there is, most bullets travel at supersonic speed, which creates a crack, a supersonic crack. And you can hear that, and that's probably the most discerning thing. But even then, it doesn't fully, there are other things that can mimic it. And I'm not saying those things occurred at this event. For instance, I mentioned I've been in some critical incidents. I have a little bit of a stress response to some loud noises. So there have been times where people have been popping balloons and it makes my heart jump. If I don't know that it's happening, my brain goes, that was a gunshot. And then it takes me a second to go, oh, it wasn't. Now those can have, those have a little bit more of a like muted, like the boom sound, the cracking sound. There was actually a personal story after a shooting I was involved in, which was a pretty traumatic event. My family went to a lake and we were on vacation and we were walking back. And obviously this sticks in my mind, right? This was a long time ago. We're walking back and I hear the sonic crack. Like it sounded like the sonic crack and my heart jumped. I was like instantly in that like alert adrenaline dump mode. And what it was there was someone in the parking lot. I'm in Oregon, so people are a little bit unique. And they had a whip, like literally like a Indiana Jones whip, and they were whipping it around and cracking it. And that crack sounds very similar to the sonic crack of a bullet. But if you had asked me in that moment, if you'd stopped me right there and you said, what was that noise? I would be like, that was a gunshot 100%. Like my body, my brain, every part of me was convinced that that was a gunshot because that's where I went. And we're actually more likely to go there when we are more attuned to that potentially being possible. So if we've already primed our brains with there's an active shooter and we hear a noise that is similar to a gunshot in noise, our brain is going to go, that was a gunshot. I'm sure, because I know I've been told that there's this threat and now I hear the gunshot. Now I hear the bang and that's the gunshot. So it's not that you're wrong. It's not like, it's just sometimes because our brain is predisposed to be thinking in that direction, things can sound that way. And unfortunately, there are a lot of things that can sound similar to a gunshot. I've even heard people, pounding a hammer on a board, like in my neighborhood, but far enough away that it almost sounds like a throaty, distant gunshot. And like, I'll pause and I'll listen. I'll be like, oh, I don't think that is. So even with all of the experience, like I understand that there's people who are like, my husband's been in the military or like they have experience and they're positive they heard a gunshot. And I believe that they're positive. I don't believe that they're making it up. I just also believe that there are potentially explanations that are not a gunshot. Now, I know it seems very coincidental that we're told that there was a firearm, we're told that there were all these risks, and then people hear what they believe is gunshots. And again, I get it. The pole thing, I honestly don't believe. I've never heard a metal pole hit the ground that sounded like a gunshot. I don't know that I've heard a lot of metal poles hit the ground, but I think there is possibility for there to be confusion there. Even just the metal doors in the arena, when those things slam hard, like they're pretty freaking loud. And I could see based off of echo that could sound that way. Now, some of you are like, Dan, you're being dismissive. I'm being dismissive of there being actual gunshots for a few reasons, not the least of which being the investigation doesn't show that there was any, like there hasn't been any proven gunshots. Now I know, and I'll talk about the conspiracy theories a little bit later, but like there's no shell casings. Yes, I know there's the question about glass, which I'll talk about, but there's no like holes in walls. And to my knowledge, there was no one who was physically shot, which is great. Blessing. Thank you, God, that there was no one who was shot and that didn't actually happen where anyone was shot. But I just don't know that I can, as a logical person who has done investigations, I would say there's no evidence to show me that there were gunshots, and it's hard to disprove a negative or to prove a negative, right? How do I prove that something didn't happen? I can't prove that it did. I understand that people have their firsthand account of like, I believe this occurred. And unfortunately, like in truth, eyewitness testimony is semi unreliable just because of the way memory works. And I'm not saying it's completely unreliable, and I'm not saying you're wrong. That's really the hardest thing. And I know there's some people who are like, Dan, I was there. Like I disagree with you. And again, I'm not trying to take away from anything you think or feel or believe. I totally understand that you heard those things and that you were terrified, and I understand. But ultimately, I just have not seen the evidence to show that there were gunshots. And I actually believe it's totally okay if you didn't know, because I'm telling you that I have been in situations where I thought gunshots were there and they weren't there. I can also tell you that same incident I was telling you about, that incident started with the suspect shooting a gun out. They punched out a window, and then they shot their gun and they shot an officer. And you can hear in one of the officers' body cam, who's on the back of the building where this happened, so he couldn't see it happen. You can hear him say and turn to his partner and go, "What the F was that?" And they're like, "I don't know. What was that?" Like the officer who said, "What the F was that?" was a firearms instructor with 15 years experience and had been in an officer involved shooting himself. And his response was, "What the heck was that?" Because it's so hard to tell. And it wasn't until they heard me get on the radio and say shots fired that they knew. And you hear them say, "Oh, shots fired, shots fired." They're all telling each other, right? It wasn't even until then that they knew that it was a gunshot. And I wouldn't have known it was a gunshot if I hadn't seen the barrel come out and hadn't seen the blast and then see my partner get shot. So I think that is easy to mistake, no matter who you are, no matter how much experience you have. It's not the movies where they can be like, "Oh, I heard that gunshot. It's this exact gun fired at this many meters and blah, blah, blah." Like, people can't actually do that. It's just not. It's not real. And there's actually machines out there that can track. They have them in various cities. They'll track gunshots, and even those, they get false reports. They get false triggers because certain things sound like a gunshot. A car backfiring sounds exactly like a gunshot. And I'm not saying that's what it was at all, but I'm just saying there are a number of noises that sound like gunshots. All right, I've been talking about that for a long enough time. So one of the things that's also been, I saw posted, is like, why would there be so many officers responding and helicopters and FBI and SWAT teams and all of this stuff if it wasn't true, if there wasn't actually an active shooter? That answer is very simple to me. That answer is, we as law enforcement, when we respond, we're only responding to what's reported to us. So we get a call, or it even could be an officer on the radio saying, "We have reports of an active shooter." As a police officer, if I hear the words, shots fired, active shooter, anything like that, I am flying to that incident with my hair on fire. I know I don't have any hair. I'm going there as fast as I possibly can, because it is literally, we know based on our experience that in an active shooter scenario, every second that passes without law enforcement intervention means that another person is seriously injured or killed. And so we have to get there as quickly as possible so we can eliminate that threat and take it away so that people are no longer harmed, and we can start treating people who've been harmed. So when that call went out on the radio, reports of an active shooter at the Dallas Convention Center, everyone came. Like, every single officer. We had an active shooting at a college in Oregon, way down south for us. We had officers that drove over 100 miles to get there, like lights and sirens for 100 miles just to try and help. Now, they shouldn't have done that. The incident was long over, but that is how officers are going to respond. So I'm sure that you had Dallas PD, Frisco, everyone around there. You had officers probably coming from everywhere, and you have SWAT teams and helicopters and all that stuff, because they're trying to figure out what's going on. They don't know what they don't know. And what they've been told is that there's reports of this, and people are coming out and saying, "We heard gunshots in here. We heard this in here." And then it sounds like there were some bomb threats and some other things. So it takes a huge response. Everyone's going to go there because they're going to try to find out what's going on. And then on top of that, there is the daunting task. I can't even imagine how they did this, because after you have an incident like this, you have to, from a law enforcement perspective, you have to ensure that the space is safe, that the report that you got, that you were coming in with thinking that there is an active shooter or there's someone armed harming people, you have to make sure that there's no one who's been shot and hurt, and you have to make sure that there's no more threat, which means you have to search everything. And that convention center is huge. On average, it takes hours to do a relatively basic search on like a multi-story house. It takes like an hour to an hour and a half to search it well. So to search the Kay Bailey, I can't even imagine how many officers that took to search and what we call clear and make sure that it is safe and that we haven't missed anything and that there's no one who's injured or there's no one who needs to be evacuated or anything like that. That is a incredibly taxing process. And that's probably why you saw SWAT teams or things of that nature. And I don't even know I'm sure they brought in their SWAT team. They probably brought in everyone they possibly could. SWAT teams just have more experience doing those things. And you may have seen officers that looked like they were a SWAT team because officers carry more and more equipment because we are training to intercede in these events as quickly as we can. And so you may have seen officers that looked SWAT-like, meaning they had all the extra gear and they were moving together as a team. And that oftentimes doesn't mean that they're SWAT. It just might mean that they're a hodgepodge group put together. But that's why you saw such a large police response. You saw such a large police response because of the reporting that came out, had every officer responding. And then they're not all going to leave until they've made sure that things are actually safe and that there isn't a threat. That's why. And these things do happen. We even had it happen in my city. If you haven't heard, there's a thing called swatting. And so we had a report of an active shooter came in through our 911 dispatch. We had a report of multiple shooters at a local elementary school armed with AK-47s and taking over classrooms. Every officer in the county, I think we had an overall 45 officers going that direction and or arrive on scene before we determined that it was fake, that it was someone who called from a fake number and just made everything up and just was basically swatting the police department. It was a complete false alarm, and we had sent the school into lockdown and we'd done all these different things all because of that. That's why you saw such a large police response, because we don't know it's true until we can verify that it's not. And it takes a really long time to verify that it's not true. If you have a venue that big and you have people running away and streaming out, like it's a whole different thing. My next thing is I've heard a lot of conversations about there being a cover up, there being some sort of some sort of conspiracy to cover up that there was actually a shooting and that Varsity, because they have so much money in Dallas, they have twisted the politicians' arms and gotten them to influence the police and make sure the police covered it all up. I don't believe that at all. I am completely biased to this. I will absolutely acknowledge that. Having been in law enforcement, I never, ever in my life was asked to cover anything up. We have Nike in our town. We investigated things related to Nike. We investigated things related to, really high up, very wealthy companies. And never once did we have leverage against us to, not report something or to cover it up or to clean it up. It just never happened. Am I saying it couldn't happen? No, I just don't believe it. I don't believe it. I don't believe that. I mean, yes, I understand that Varsity is a very wealthy company, and I understand that they've come under scrutiny, deservedly so in certain circumstances. I don't know that they have the juice to cover this up. Like, I don't know how they would be able to say, don't tell anyone. Like, it's unlikely. Does that mean that there couldn't have been gunshots somewhere involved in a fight? That someone couldn't have shot a gun in the air and then cleaned up the brass casings and then left? No, I just also think that there would be video evidence and that would eventually come out. There is surveillance all around the Kay Bailey Convention Center, and you could say, well, they're probably suppressing it. That actually is less believable for me than an incident occurred and somewhere someone heard something that they either believed was gunshots or they saw something that they thought was concerning, and then there was some sort of triggered mass hysteria event that was basically a game of telephone that eventually got to some security officers or someone who put it out on a radio transmission that there was an active shooter, and then that disseminated everywhere, and then we had this event. I think that's actually more believable than something that I've personally not seen, which is a mass cover up of gunfire at an event like this. There's also just so many officers that responded that, like, if there was evidence, you would be hearing about it beyond just the bullet holes in the glass. And now I'm going to go to the bullet holes in the glass conspiracy really quick. So I saw the video and I had people send it to me, what do you think of this? There's bullet holes in glass. Here's what I'll tell you. I'm not an expert in bullet holes in glass per se. Like, I have no advanced certification. What I can tell you is this. I've shot bullets through glass before. I've seen bullets go through glass in a variety of circumstances. I've seen bullet resistant glass when we were in Iraq and what that does. And the images that I saw posted online they're not, in my opinion, they are not bullets. Bullets pass through glass. And now some people would say, well, not if it's bulletproof. I would be willing to bet you that the pane glass on the outside of the Kay Bailey Convention Center is not bullet resistant glass. That is really expensive stuff and really heavy and doesn't look like single pane glass. Even if it was treated with a film, like a safety film like you have on your car, it would still look different. And I've seen glass that's been shot like that. Number one, bullets pass through glass. Bullets do not deflect off of glass, generally speaking. And none of those images looked like actual holes in glass. They looked like chips that were taken out of the glass. Bullets go through, and bullets leave a diameter hole of the size of the bullet. They don't make a smaller hole, generally speaking, unless it's like some sort of a fragment. And then you would see some sort of impact near where that fragment was created. That doesn't hold a lot of water for me, that those are bullet holes. They just don't, or caused by bullets. They don't look like bullet holes to me in my experience. Now, I know there's people who are like, here's a picture of my vehicle from Iraq and it looks exactly the same. Again, bullet resistant glass versus non. Again, you can't convince me that that was bullet resistant glass. If someone has evidence that that's bullet resistant, I'd love to hear it, because I've seen that. I know the exact area that they are talking about, and I've walked through those things, and those windows are not super sturdy. They're standard, I think, double pane style glass. So I don't think those are bullet holes. I certainly don't think that they're strong enough to resist a bullet and make it deflect. You also, in my experience, see much more of a spider web style effect from a bullet hitting any glass, especially glass that's treated with any sort of protective film or ballistic protection, kind of any sort of plexiglass style. You see it spider a lot more. And those look, again, more like a significant chip, like it was hit by a flying rock or something like that chipped the glass. So that's my opinion on the glass. I just don't see those as actual bullet holes. And I know I saw someone say, I've seen those before. They were there last year. I honestly think I saw those there last year too, but that could just be me not remembering correctly. But again, ultimately, I don't think they look like bullet holes. Another thing that's come up in all of this is there was a debate, and I actually saw some celebration of and some condemnation of people who had concealed handguns at the event. So the question is, should there be concealed weapons holders allowed to carry their guns at cheerleading events? I think you're entitled to your opinion either way. Purely my opinion. I don't personally worry about concealed weapons holders. They are, statistically speaking, some of the least likely people to commit violent crimes with their firearms. They tend to be much more on the law-abiding approach. You do see people who have concealed weapons that use them inappropriately, but most of the time, those are not actually legal concealed weapons holders. So I personally don't have a huge issue with people who are carrying concealed. Also, most people who are carrying concealed, not everyone, but most, tend to conduct themselves to a different standard. So like me, when I'm carrying my gun, I wouldn't drink, because I'm not going to be under the influence if I'm carrying a firearm. I know a lot of concealed weapons holders hold themselves to the same standard. They'll maybe have like a beer or something like that. And it sounds like there was a number of circumstances where there were a number of concealed weapons carriers at this event, and people who, took kids aside, kind of protected kids, held down rooms, held down parking structures. My personal recommendation, because I think this is also part of the problem, is I think people did see guns. I think people saw concealed weapons holders take out guns. I think people saw police officers with guns, and even under stress, when you see a police officer with a gun, you might not realize the only thing you might see is the gun and not even see the full uniform. So my recommendation as a concealed weapons carrier, as someone who's been in these incidents before and trained people on how to respond to these incidents, I would suggest as a concealed weapons holder, you keep your weapon concealed until you know there is a threat in very close proximity or immediately within your proximity. Otherwise, you are at extreme danger. One, you're potentially exacerbating the situation because if you're not clearly identified, and even when you are, you still may not be clearly identified enough for people who are panicked. You are potentially giving yourself the opportunity to get shot by responding police who may think you are the deadly threat. And I say this because we ran training yearly. And when I say I participated in it a bunch. I helped with it, but I was never on our SWAT team, and our SWAT team ran this training. But our joint agencies ran a training. And in one of the scenarios, the officers going through the active threat response training would be told they're going into a school and we're giving them reports of gunshots, shooting blanks and things like that so they can respond to them. We're giving them those indicators and they're going to them. And we actually had it set up so that a role player dressed in a complete police uniform, they would be wearing a complete uniform, carrying a gun out, would come around a corner very quickly with their gun leading the way first, like most people carry a gun, coming around that corner. And over 50% of the time, that person dressed as a police officer would get shot by other police officers before they clearly identified that they were not a threat. And it's because, and this was just in training, this was not even with the high stress of like truly believing you're in a life and death scenario. And we still saw people make the mistake. If you are dressed in plain clothes and you are in an area where police are responding, where they think there is someone armed and shooting people, and they come around a corner and they see you with their gun, they're oftentimes not even going to give you a warning. They're oftentimes just going to shoot first because they're going to assume that you're the deadly threat. Now, you may not agree with that, and we encourage them to take that pause, but there are so many circumstances where that could go very poorly. So I would recommend, if you are carrying a concealed gun ever in your life and you're in that kind of circumstance, to keep your gun concealed until you believe there is an immediate threat. Now, I've heard stories of people who are walking with like their hand on their hip and things like that. I actually think that's much more okay, right? I can still draw quickly, but I think that's better than having a gun out and like walking around with that gun. You're just asking for trouble, and you're going to potentially induce more panic, especially if you don't know there's an immediate threat. Another thing I want to talk about with gunshots is we've heard reports of gunshots in every hall almost. I feel like I've heard reports from people in every single hall. It's like, oh, you can hear it on the varsity TV here, or you can hear gunshots here, you can hear gunshots here, you can hear gunshots here, which would be possible if there was truly an active shooter walking through the venue. But even then, you wouldn't hear it in all of the halls at the same time. So although gunshots are loud, cheer competitions are insanely loud. And especially NCA, you absolutely positively would not hear gunshots in the arena if someone was shooting. Even in my opinion, if they were in Hall A, which is right next to the arena, I don't think you would hear gunshots in the arena with the music, with everything going on, with all the ambient sound, with all the doors closed and the curtains and all those other things. That would eat up that sound pretty well. I've done practices of this where we were doing training and we were in buildings while people were like listening for it. We were shooting very loud blanks to see when they could hear it. And generally speaking, they were not hearing it until it was moderately close, because buildings have insulation. These convention centers, there's cement walls, there's lots of space, and there's lots of bodies in that space, and there's loud music, and there's all those things. So that sound is not going to travel super duper far, especially with all the music and everything going on at these events. It's very, very loud. So yeah, anyways, don't want to digress too far. The next thing is, should alcohol be allowed at competitions? Now, to my knowledge, I don't know that NCA serves alcohol in the venue. I know there's alcohol served at the Omni. I'm mixed on this. So I don't think people need to be drinking at cheerleading competitions, but I also believe that adults can be adults. I don't think that alcohol generally brings anything positive to the mix. I think that it does create some problems. I don't know that that would have solved this problem. I just don't know enough details. I don't know that the dads that got in a fight were even drunk. I just don't know those things. Generally, I can say from a career in law enforcement is that alcohol doesn't lead people to making good decisions. I used to take people out on ride-alongs at night, and I would always say, we deal with a drug and alcohol-induced craziness all night. That's what we're going to do. That would typically be what we would do. People would almost always be under the influence in some way. I mean, I'm saying almost always, not always, but very, very frequently we were dealing with people who were under the influence of drugs, under the influence of alcohol, and it generally led them to make bad decisions. So I don't think it would be bad to not have alcohol, at least served at events. That's my personal opinion. But I also know that just like I would say concealed weapons holders, the vast majority of parents that go to an event and, have a glass of wine at the bar and then go watch their kids perform, like they're not causing problems. They're not doing anything wrong. Generally, I think that no one should be drunk at a cheer event, but I also think that people should just be responsible and manage their alcohol, generally speaking. One of the things that came up was that there was, and I just want to answer some questions. I saw people saying, see, if there was no active shooting, why would they post these posters, no guns being allowed? And I'll give you two reasons. Number one, I've seen those posters up and around NCA. I saw them last year. I saw posters outside the arena, no guns, no knives, no this, no that, all those posters. I saw them. So I think they've been around. I know they added more. And they also added the hey, even if you have a concealed handgun, we don't want you to bring this. One of the reasons that they might do more of that, even if there was no gun, is because every person who is a gun owner who was at that event or who was planning to come to the event after what happened the day before was like, oh, I'm bringing my gun today. I'm going to make sure that no one's going to hurt me or my family. So I get that they were like, hey, a lot more people might bring guns today. And so we're going to be really on top of it. We're going to let everyone know nobody's bringing a gun. We want no guns around here because people are going to be at high alert. And we just don't want there to be another incident because something happens or someone is carrying a concealed handgun or someone sees that gun under someone's shirt or something like that. Like, we're just going to take it all away. So I think that would, in my mind, that's the explanation for why to post the signs, and also to hopefully help people feel like a little more secure, like, hey, they're taking steps to make sure that there are no guns. Another question that was commented on and again, most of these things are things I've seen on social media. Someone said, how are they going to increase security from day one to day two? They're not going to be able to recruit. You're right. They wouldn't be able to recruit standard security guards, but I'm sure they upped their police presence, and that's pretty easy. I mean, they put out and say, hey, we had this incident. There's now overtime available for anyone that can work. And most officers are willing to work overtime. There's a lot of officers willing to get time and a half to be at a convention center. And especially after an event like that, there's more people who are like, yeah, you know what? I'm going to go make sure that this is safe. So I'm willing to bet that they increase their footprint. Now, I've heard a number of reports that there was no security at all. Now, again, I wasn't there. But in my experience at NCA, there is at least 2 security officers at each door or more, and they're always checking to see if you've paid to get in. That's their primary role. They're kind of an access control. And then I typically have seen multiple Dallas PD officers around the event. Like, I know because I've had conversations with them. I've stopped and chatted with them. And I typically see anywhere from 5 to 10 armed officers on site just walking around the upper halls at NCA Nationals every year. And at most events I go to, I see armed officers. I would rather see armed police officers than the general security officer, security guard, because most of the time, in my experience, the security guards are really not providing much security. They're more just like an access point control than they are anything else. They're a set of eyes and ears, but they're not going to be able to really respond to anything significant. And that's why I like seeing uniformed officers who are armed at our events. And even in Portland, most event centers have some sort of a security requirement, and or oftentimes will have a partnership with the local law enforcement. And anytime there's an event of a certain size, there's a certain number of officers that have to be contracted to work the event. So I'm nearly positive that the convention center has something like that, because every major convention center has law enforcement that work those events all the time. And it's a contract that they have in place with the city and with the local police unions as well. I've personally seen that. Now, I have a lot of opinions, and some of you are like, Dan, you're just sitting here telling us all your opinions. I have a lot of opinions on what can be done better, and that's going to be my next episode, because I do think that there were mistakes, and I do think that there's things that could have been done better. But I wanted to kind of give you some background first on my opinions on what I can see that happened and why I'm giving the recommendations that I am in terms of next steps forward. The biggest thing is that we need to understand that this was a massively unexpected event, and that in these kind of circumstances, common sense isn't common because it's an extraordinary circumstance. So there is no common sense with it. And this actually was something that used to get said a lot in a training that some officers used to give. And I took it out once I took over, which they would give an active threat training, and they would say, when in doubt, use your common sense. And it always bothered me because there isn't any common sense. Common sense results in this is a logical thing, and we're here and we can figure it out based off of just our general sense. We don't live in a society where we are likely to experience violence like this on a regular basis. And so we don't have any sort of common sense to pull upon. It's an uncommon situation. And so the only thing we can do is we can prepare and train and build knowledge and understanding around that. And that's going to be what I'm going to go into on the next episode. I want to thank you for listening to my 50 minutes of chat on my opinions on what happened and my thoughts. Ultimately, I wanted to bring hopefully at least a small feeling of, I don't even know if comfort is the right word, but that it's okay to feel however it is you're feeling, which Jeff and I talked about on our conversation. And that I don't believe that our athletes and our industry and our staff and our coaches and all our parents, all these amazing people, I don't personally believe that any of them were under immediate threat of gun violence. Based off of all of the information that I can find, I don't believe that there was a shooting. Now, there may have been gunshots fired somewhere, but I don't think that there was a shooting directed at athletes, parents, or families that occurred at NCA Nationals based off of the available evidence at hand right now. I think that this is a very big wake-up call for us, that there are things that we need to be prepared for, and we do need to do better. And if we can have that wake-up call without the loss of life, as horrible as it is, the only way we get something positive out of this horrible experience is by learning from it. The biggest mistake of any error in life is failing to make change and failing to learn from it. So I hope that we as an industry move forward, and gym owners and event producers and all of those things, we move forward to make our events safer, ensure these kind of things can't happen again, and ensure even worse doesn't happen. All right, everyone, I appreciate you because you joined me for this episode. And if you listen the whole time, thank you. I very much appreciate it. I'm sorry about my voice. It is really thrashed. I'm about to record the next what to do and what we can change episode right now. And with that, we will catch you on the next episode.